Wicked gives a different perspective of the story in The Wizard of Oz, and how they connect, the timeline, and many other interesting parallels between the two will all teach you everything and more you need to understand as we break down the connection between Wicked and The Wizard of Oz. The 1939 musical The Wizard of Oz is a story many grew up with, and which the media have expanded on over the years. It's based on the 1900 children's novel of the same name by Frank Baum. Wicked is based on the Broadway musical written by Winnie Holzman, which was also loosely inspired by the 1995 novel Wicked: The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire. So they might be very similar regarding the characters and storyline, but their timeline ultimately evolves into each other. And the connection between these two great movies is everything and more as we explain it all in great detail. Starting from the beginning of the timeline, let's make a graphical illustration of Wicked and then The Wizard of Oz, which will make our explanation flow even better as we go on. The timeline of The Wizard of Oz is a couple of weeks in the time frame of Wicked, which spans many years. The Wizard of Oz goes pretty smoothly, starting with Dorothy dropping in and landing on the Wicked Witch of the East. From there, Glinda meets Dorothy, gives her the shoes, and then Dorothy goes on a journey to meet the wizard. On the journey to the wizard, which was meant to be a short trip so she could go back home, Dorothy meets the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion, and the Wicked Witch also tortures her along the way until she eventually meets the wizard, melted the Wicked Witch, till she gets to go home, which ended happily for Dorothy. Interestingly, Wicked starts from where The Wizard of Oz ends, where we learn that the Wicked Witch of the West is called Elphaba, and Dorothy has just melted her with the townspeople celebrating her demise. Then Glinda, the Good Witch, comes to greet them and uses the opportunity to tell them how she and Elphaba knew each other. She started by telling how Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, was born green because her mother cheated on her father, the governor of Munchkinland, after drinking a green elixir. Elphaba's mother also shares another daughter, Nessarose, with her father, who prefers Nessarose, the Wicked Witch of the East, who turns out to be the family's prized possession. Most of the interesting, emotional, and intriguing parts of the story Glinda tells the townspeople about Glinda and Elphaba happen mainly at Shiz University. The sisters Elphaba and Nessarose, along with Glinda, were all in attendance at this school, and Elphaba and Glinda ended up being paired as roommates. At the beginning of their relationship, they hated each other until they started warming up to themselves and becoming friends. Also, at this university, a couple of love triangles took place for some character connections, with the most important one being with Fiyero among the two roommates. Glinda is in love with Fiyero, who doesn't share the same feelings as he's in love with Elphaba. However, Nessa loves a munchkin called Bock, who loves Glinda, so it's more like a love trapezium. But beneath all these matters of the heart was a much stronger drama that has to do with the government trying to stop the animals of Oz from speaking. And Elphaba is a strong advocate against the policy the government is trying to enforce. Now, the first connection we will make to The Wizard of Oz is that Elphaba frees a lion cub in a cage in a classroom, which then becomes the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz. As the Wicked timeline continues, Elphaba and Glinda are invited to meet the wizard they realize is causing this harm. Then, defying gravity happens, and Act 1 of the play ends here. There was a time jump between Acts 1 and 2, which began 2 years later. Elphaba visited Nessa and gave her slippers superpowers so she could walk again. However, that's when Bock leaves Nessa because he realizes she no longer needs him. But the drama intensifies after Nessa puts an accidental spell on Bock to make him lose his heart. And that's when Bock becomes the Tin Man we initially established in The Wizard of Oz. The government goes after Elphaba and wants to capture her, so they use Nessa as bait to put her in danger. For this, they summon a storm, which causes a twister and a house to fall on Nessa, leading to her demise, and that becomes exactly the timeline where The Wizard of Oz begins. As we've explained earlier, Glinda meets Dorothy and gives her Nessa's slippers, and the story goes from there to the end of The Wizard of Oz. Since Nessa has been gotten rid of, Elphaba moves to protect her love, Fiyero. So, to protect Fiyero, Elphaba puts a spell on him, which accidentally turns Fiyero into the Scarecrow Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. But the story gets even more fascinating from there as Elphaba captures Dorothy to get her sister's shoes back, and that's precisely where the two timelines meet up. But that's exactly where the twist began in Wicked, because it doesn't end here in the timeline. After Elphaba melts, Glinda discovers all that's left is a hat and the green elixir, and she puts together the fact that the wizard was Elphaba's father this whole time, which is how Elphaba has her magical powers. The story in Wicked ends with Fiyero, the Scarecrow, knocking on the door where Elphaba melted and realizing that she had faked her demise. With the plot twist, Fiyero and Elphaba ride off into the sunset happily ever after with no one ever finding out, which is an entirely different turnout from what we learned in The Wizard of Oz. While The Wizard of Oz is a simple story of good and evil, Wicked retells the story by adding moral ambiguity. Now, we will answer many questions that have continued to confuse viewers about The Wizard of Oz and Wicked. Although many people have seen The Wizard of Oz, a lot are just getting to learn about this great classic from the latest loose adaptation of the story Wicked. So this has prompted most people to ask if they need to watch The Wizard of Oz before hitting the cinema for Wicked, and the simple answer is no. However, The Wizard of Oz is considered one of the greatest films of all. You can familiarize yourself with the setting and story and see the differences between the two films. Also, Wicked contains many Easter eggs that can only be picked up by someone who has seen and remembered the iconic moments of The Wizard of Oz. However, all you need to know about Wicked's narrative is that there is an evil witch of the West and a good witch named Glinda the Good. The film dives into their shared past and how their reputations don't match reality. Wicked isn't quite a standard to any other The Wizard of Oz story, and there are quite a few of them, but rather a revisionist prequel that imagines a more complex environment than we see in other Oz films and literature. Also, because the timeline can be confusing, many have wondered if Wicked is a prequel to The Wizard of Oz, and the answer will further enlighten us on the timelines of these two movies. Wicked is based on a Broadway musical, the second highest grossing Broadway musical ever. However, this Broadway musical is adapted from Gregory Maguire's novel titled Wicked. The Wicked movie is in two parts and will conclude in parallel to The Wizard of Oz, as we've illustrated earlier, and there are some details from the original that will be missing. Although it's the same setting, Wicked just used The Wizard of Oz as an inspiration to launch a new meaning and story that diverted from the original. Also, Gregory's novel is much darker and more complicated than the Broadway musical and the film. Although many references from the original movie and book can be found in Wicked, the film found ways to create its own lore that is easy to follow even without seeing The Wizard of Oz. Some details from the novel that were missed in the original movie were included in Wicked, one of which is the silver slippers that Dorothy wears, but they were changed to red to show off the vibrance of Technicolor and stand in contrast to the yellow brick road. Interestingly enough, there are many timelines in the Wicked and the Wizard of Oz franchises, all of which have unique story arcs. The Wizard of Oz books have inspired other stories and birthed new parallel timelines. Baum, who wrote the novels, intended to create a modern American fairy tale, and he got it just right. The lore that has come out of Baum's books has been remixed and rearranged many times. His novels deal with the wizard as a shameless con man, a polished salesman who genuinely helps Dorothy and her group of outcasts. This wizard is also a trickster who can successfully fool the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and the Scarecrow into self-confidence, which they all don't have. In the book, the Tin Man can be perceived as very empathetic, the Cowardly Lion is brave from the start, and the Scarecrow is highly intelligent. Still, they all have one thing in common: they have no belief in themselves. The wizard persuades the three to accept the values they openly exhibited throughout the book using his theatrical abilities, because practically every character in The Wizard of Oz is fooled by their illusions and can only reach their full potential after believing the right kind of lie, and the film investigates the power of narrative. To make the Emerald City appear more bright than it is, the wizard requires that all Star Wars. Due to popular demand, Baum wrote numerous sequels to The Wizard of Oz, but his initial narrative was surprisingly influential. Wicked reframes the Wicked Witch as a misunderstood figure while reinterpreting the wizard as an apparent monster bent on conquering Oz through devious methods. If Wicked Wicked has your curiosity in the land of Oz, there are other adaptations for newfound Oz fans to appreciate. One of the best and most underappreciated is the 1985 film Return to Oz, which combines two of Baum's book sequels into a compelling drama about Dorothy returning to discover the Emerald City in ruins. Dorothy recruits another group of outcasts and sets out to restore the land. Still, the picture is full of strange, unnerving scenes, reminiscent of a horror film for children, and features some of the best visual effects on screen. However, the most significant comparison in this franchise is the original film The Wizard of Oz and Wicked, in which the parallel timeline is critical in understanding how the story goes as we prepare for the second part of the film.